So we've seen how short-term memory is an important type of memory between our super quick sensory memory and the more long-lasting long-term memory, but there were some problems with the original formulation of short-term memory in the modal model. Specifically, it didn't explain complex behaviors very well, and it kind of lumped in various ways of encoding information, and just overall, the box metaphor was too simplistic for all the things that we use short-term memory for. After all, think about all the stuff short-term memory is involved in, where we're holding and using information for like learning and complex reasoning and reading and language comprehension and so many other tasks. Meanwhile, the modal model makes it seem like short-term memory is just another box, passively holding on to a few items, a few pieces of information, when really, in order to describe all that we use it for, we need a more dynamic version of short-term memory. So that leads to the more modern formulation that we call working memory. At its most basic, we could compare working memory to the old way of thinking about it by saying, first, that working memory is concerned primarily with manipulation of information rather than just storage of information. And second, that working memory is not one single box, but consists of a number of different components working together, rather than just one kind of storage place. So this researcher named Alan Baddeley actually proposed the idea of working memory as having the following kind of handful of subsystems involving both storage and control processes. So basically we're taking the short-term memory box and we're just going to shove all this stuff into it, making a more complex and also more dynamic version of our short-term memory system. So we'll talk about each of these parts in turn. But the important thing to notice initially here is that there's a sort of control process in charge of things called the central executive. And you can think of the other pieces in here in working memory as being sort of subservient to that executive functioning. So here's just another diagram, another way of drawing Baddeley's model of working memory. Just drawing a little differently here, but we still have in the middle in red the central executive. That's connected to some visual processes going on up top and some auditory or verbal processes in storage down below. And then there's this episodic buffer thing in green. We'll talk about that. And all those other systems there connect to long-term memory. So long-term memory, that's not part of working memory, right? That's the next stage in our modal model that we'll talk about. But of course, working memory has to connect to long-term memory in order to encode things into it and retrieve things out of it. So kind of laying down and retrieving more permanent memories. So let's talk about each of these pieces of the working memory model. So first off, there's something called the phonological loop. You can kind of think of this like an area for briefly storing and processing verbal and auditory information for a short period of time. This is also the system that's involved when you're doing covert rehearsal, like when you're subvocally repeating some words in your head to remember them, or like some digits that you want to remember, something like that. Then there's the visuospatial sketchpad. This is similar to the phonological loop, but now for visual and spatial kind of information. So it's used for maintaining and processing, visual images and spatial stuff. And as we've seen, this kind of info decays pretty rapidly unless it's rehearsed. Then there's the episodic buffer, which is used kind of for storage, but more importantly for integration of information in what we might call a multimodal code, meaning it holds together an integrated episode between those other systems that use their own different codes, and it's combining things, combining like visual and auditory and such. Like if you watched your friend drop a coffee mug this morning, you saw the mug fall visually, you also heard it shatter and heard your friend swear, and even though the visual and auditory elements might be processed in different areas, the episodic buffer kind of puts them together into a combined episode, which may get laid down then in your long-term memory. You'll remember that time your friend dropped the mug, right? And we'll discuss that later when we talk about episodic memory as a type of long-term memory. Finally, there's that piece, the central executive, that controls it all. So you can think of it kind of as a process that focuses, divides, and allocates our attention, helps control things, put our attention towards relevant items or inhibit irrelevant ones, right? Selective attention. It's also involved in Planning, like sequence of tasks, like thinking step by step by step when we want to accomplish goals, or kind of scheduling processes when we're doing any sort of complex task. The brain is behind the scenes kind of coordinating, oh, this and then this and then this. Even for something like a motor task, we might need to plan different parts of the action, right? This is often going to be like helping us switch between different parts or different elements or different steps in a process. And the whole time it's updating and checking the contents of those other components we talked about, like the phonological loop, the sketchpad, things like that, to determine the next step in a sequence so that we can accomplish those complex tasks. Like when we're doing a math problem in our head, or reasoning through someone's political argument, or maybe just weighing two different purchase options that, might vary on 5 or 6 different dimensions. Like different houses you want to consider buying will have very different quality. You're comparing on a bunch of different dimensions all at once, right? That means that a lot of stuff you have to manage and compare in your head, in working memory. The central executive is coordinating that so you can compare things like what the two houses look like, but also other elements, right? Other modalities. That said, the central executive is honestly the least studied and the least understood component, probably just because it's the most complex. In fact, at one point, Baddeley even admitted early on, our initial specification of the central executive was so vague as to serve as little more than a rag bag. Basically, some process must be coordinating these different subsystems. So the central executive was posited for that role. So without getting too lost in all the details of the working memory model, we could kind of just summarize it like this. So the working memory model is the part in red here. We could summarize it like this. Basically, our memory box that goes between sensory memory and long-term memory, it's actually a set of systems that work together. It's made up of some distinct storage for different modalities, all of which are limited in capacity and duration, with some way of combining the information across different modalities and codes and dynamically using that information. So in some way, kind of focusing our attention, using that information for a particular task, all while constantly interacting with long-term memory. So like as you can see at the bottom here, in long-term memory, we store all sorts of like knowledge of language, right? So when some verbal information comes into the phonological loop, that loop is going to be pulling from long-term memory to recognize and understand the words and process and make sense of them that way. But likewise, when something hits the visuospatial sketchpad, it's going to interact with our long-term visual memory, where visual meaning has been stored, like recognizing what a giraffe or a zebra looks like, recognizing the meaning of a particular shape and color combination. And likewise, the episodic buffer, it's constructing the sense of like a specific episodic experience, right? That allows us to lay down episodic memories, meaning memories of a specific event in time rather than just remembering things as facts. And when we think back to a specific embarrassing memory, right, we're pulling from episodic long-term memory into the episodic buffer and reactivating those elements of the old episode, like the sights and the sounds that happened during it. So that is the basic working memory model. Now, let's see some evidence supporting this idea that there are these distinct components. Let's start with the phonological loop. We've already seen one experimental result that's consistent with the phonological loop, and that's the phonological similarity effect. So when people make memory errors, like you're just trying to remember some letters you heard before, or things like that, when we make errors, like trying to recall that list of letters, it's not random. Instead, people tend to confuse items that sound similar. So, F sounds more similar to S and X than it does to E and V and G, which all sound similar to each other. There's also something called the word length effect. Turns out it is easier to remember lists of short words, and by short I mean ones that have fewer syllables, than long words, meaning ones with lots of syllables. And specifically, we've shown that this is because it takes more time to rehearse the long words. So with short words, we can remember the list. You're trying to memorize this list of words. We can remember the list better because we can repeat more of those words in a given amount of time than if we had words that took longer to pronounce, words with more syllables. Those we don't remember as well, specifically because we get fewer chances to repeat it, fewer times to rehearse it before the timer runs out. Additionally, there's an effect called articulatory suppression, or the articulatory suppression effect, where repeating irrelevant sound, like just using your sound system, basically, your phonological loop, repeating irrelevant sound messes up our memory by interfering with rehearsal. Like, for example, just having someone say the, over and over makes it very hard to memorize a different list of words, like one we present on the screen, because articulating those sounds, articulating the, is using up the phonological loop. So we can't also be rehearsing the memory list phonologically. So let's try a demonstration of articulatory suppression. Let's do this effect. Grab a pen and paper. Pause the video if you need to go grab a pen and paper. Okay. On the next slide, I'm going to show you a bunch of words to memorize. Just try and memorize the list of words, but here's the key. Memorize the list of words while repeating the number 5 to yourself continuously at a pretty quick rate. So eventually those words you see, they're going to disappear, but that's just a delay. You have to keep chanting 5 until it instructs you to recall. So I'm going to start us chanting 5, and you have to keep chanting it until you see the word recall on the screen, at which point you'll write down the words. So here we go, just chanting 5, 5, 5, 5. Make sense? Here we go. Start chanting now with me. 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. Keep going. 5, 5. You get the idea. Okay, recall. Write them down. Just as many as you can remember. You don't have to get all of them. And pause the video if you need to keep writing before we move on. So, okay, here is the list. Feel free to pause and check your answers if you want. Most people miss quite a few of these words, even though we had a while to look at them, and that's because we can't rehearse them to ourselves when we're busy articulating some other word in our phonological loop. Now, there is a trick you can try and use here, which is recruiting your visuospatial sketchpad. So if you're sitting there chanting 5, 5, 5 in the phonological loop, then you could try and memorize these words by picturing them. Picturing a tree, picturing a pencil, picturing a marshmallow, and so on. The problem is that works pretty well for simple nouns and maybe some verbs. It isn't so great for abstract words like progress that are harder and slower to picture. So that doesn't work very well. But otherwise, if you can recruit the visuospatial sketchpad, then you don't get as much of an articulatory suppression effect, right? You can actually memorize this list much better. But the fact that we can't do it our normal way shows that we normally do memorize words, right? We learn a list like this phonologically, and that if our phonological loop is busy, then we can't use it for the memory. But yeah, that was the articulatory suppression effect, showing that we got this helpful but limited phonological loop for verbal and auditory information. What about the visuospatial sketchpad then? As I said before, the visuospatial sketchpad, it stores and manipulates like visual or spatial information. And it's especially needed when information can't be recoded into a phonological representation. So we know this is a distinct component because of what happens when we do tasks that are inherently very spatial. For example, the famous mental rotation task. You might have seen something like this on an intelligence test or just like a fun online quiz or something, but basically you're shown some blocks in a particular orientation in 3 dimensions for the harder version of it, and then you're shown some comparison objects and you have to decide whether the comparison is a rotated version of the original object or a different shape. Now the interesting thing about this task is that manipulating or holding other visuospatial information interferes with your performance. You do worse. Whereas with verbal tasks or holding verbal information, you get no real interference here. So we seem to have a distinct system for visuospatial stuff. Now here's an example of the mental rotation task so you can see what I'm talking about. Look at the object on the left and then pick out which two pictures on the right are the same object but rotated. Only two of them work. Now, you can pause if you want to keep thinking about it before I give the answer. But it is the first and third ones here. They're the same shape as our original one on the left. Whereas the second and fourth, they can't work. They're different shapes. Let's try another example. Same idea. Look at the one on the left. Now, which of the two pictures on the right, of those four, which two are a rotated version of it? Okay, and again, you can pause if you want to keep thinking about it before I give the answer. But it is the first and the fourth one here that match the original shape. So that is the mental rotation task. It's something we've studied a ton in cognitive psychology, and it's also used in like neuropsychological batteries sometimes to check for impairment of visual spatial processing. Now, there's one thing about this task that really hammers home the fact that it's recruiting a distinct visuospatial system in our working memory, and that's what we see here in this reaction time data. So this is reaction time on how long it takes people, on average, to solve a simple mental rotation comparison. On the y-axis, we got reaction time. So lower means quicker, lower is better performance. On the x-axis along the bottom, we've got the angular difference between the reference object and the comparison object that we're checking. We're checking whether it matches. So if they're just slightly rotated versions of each other, like 20 degrees off, we can answer the yes/no question in under 2 seconds. But if they're more rotated, like 120 degrees, you can see it takes closer to 4 seconds. So we got this super clear, very linear relationship between degree of rotation and the reaction time to solve the problem, which suggests that during the task, the representation at play must be visuospatial in some way, like it's being rotated over time, like people are kind of picturing the object moving to see if it aligns with the other object, using what must be a nonverbal part of working memory. So evidence like this is consistent with the idea that working memory has a separate visuospatial sketchpad component, something separate from the phonological loop that we use for verbal type tasks. At any rate, we won't go too much further into the working memory model, but this is enough that you'll understand what's being referenced if you see it in the literature. Big picture takeaway here is that the modal model did have the basics right. We're not throwing out the modal model, we're just updating it. So Baddeley updated it to replace the short-term memory part, the simple storage box in the middle, with a much more dynamic and multi-component version that we call working memory. So now our more complete modal model would look something a little more like this. Sensory memory very, very briefly stores everything that hits our senses. But as we saw, only bits of that, the bits we attend to, get transferred on to working memory, which itself has a central executive controlling some subsystems, and those in turn interact with long-term memory, both encoding information into it and retrieving information out of it. So it's just an updated modal model. Now, what about the neuro side, the physiology of working memory in the brain? Where is all this dynamic storage and processing happening? And the full answer would be lots of places across the brain. But one particular brain location seems to be really crucial to everything we do with working memory, and that's the prefrontal cortex, sometimes shortened to just PFC. This is part of the frontal cortex. It's this area up at the very front of our brain, and it seems necessary for holding working memory information briefly. We know that because, for example, if we remove the prefrontal cortex, working memory totally fails. Like in an animal model, we might train a monkey on the simplest of memory tasks. We show it that we're hiding food in one of two possible holes, so it sees us hide the food, then we cover him up, and we make the monkey wait during a short delay, like 5 or 10 seconds. Then we let the monkey reach out and look in one of the holes. Like to pick one side, it looks under one side and it gets the food if it remembered the correct side where it saw the food hidden a few seconds ago. Now, Normal monkeys can figure this task out in no time at all, especially if it's a food they like. But if we lesion the prefrontal cortex, so they don't have a functioning PFC, now the monkey can't do this super simple memory task. It seems unable to hold that simple bit of information for even a few seconds. Likewise, when we do working memory tasks with humans during the brain imaging or something like that, we consistently see the prefrontal cortex active regardless of the format or modality of the task. Like whether it's visual or auditory or whatever, if it's a working memory task, the prefrontal cortex is pretty much always being activated. And in fact, we've just discovered some of the kind of low-level neural mechanisms by which something like visual spatial working memory does what it does. For example, we found individual neurons in the prefrontal cortex that fire only when a target is in a specific visual location. Now, that's not super weird. I mean, you would think, initially, okay, there's going to be something like that in the back of our brain, in the occipital lobe, certainly. But we've also got some copies kind of up here, some neurons that also do that up here in the prefrontal cortex. So for example, we can train a monkey to fixate and look at the center of a screen. So it's staring at the middle. Then we flash a target in one part of the visual field, just some location that it's going to need to remember where that flash happened if it wants to earn a treat during the recall phase a bit later. And in the prefrontal cortex, we find a neuron that'll go off only when the target shows up in, say, the upper left part of the visual field. But nearby, there might be a different neuron that goes off when the target shows up in the upper right visual field, or other neurons nearby that are specific to other locations. So we've got neurons that track specific locations in the visual field. But that's a purely perceptual thing, right? That has nothing to do with memory yet. We're just registering where the object flashed in the visual field. Meanwhile, though, the intriguing thing is that these same neurons in the prefrontal cortex, these individual neurons tracking the location where the object showed up, they continue to fire even after the target disappears, assuming that the monkey has learned that this is a memory task and that it's going to need to remember the location. So once they've practiced this a bunch and they understand, oh, it's a memory task, I have to figure out where the thing flashed earlier, then we find that these neurons will keep firing even once the target has disappeared. So that's what makes this a memory task, right? And we've got this single cell basis, single neuron basis for how the brain is keeping track of a spatial location in memory, even once the stimulus has disappeared. That neural mechanism we're talking about, that's in the prefrontal cortex. So the neuron keep firing after the delay. That's basically like a memory neuron, a spatial, visuospatial mechanism at the neural level for how we're able to do something like this. Now, to be very clear, other brain areas are also involved in working memory. Like working memory, like most complex tasks that our brain does, is distributed all over the brain in different parts. So the prefrontal cortex is super important, but also some different areas are involved that are specific to the phonological loop or the visuospatial sketchpad, the episodic buffer, the central executive, and so on. So let me give you an example of that. Imagine two simple tasks we could have someone do while we put them in like an fMRI scanner. So we're measuring brain activity when they do either this first task up top here or the second task on the bottom here. And you can see time is going for each trial. We're talking about like starting up here, then this, then this, then this, or start here, then this, then this, then this. Okay. So the top set of pictures here is a memory task. They look at a fixation cross for 500 milliseconds. So it's just half of a second. Then some visual pattern shows up briefly. For a fifth of a second, a visual pattern shows up, some dots on the screen. Then they have to look at a fixation cross for a full 3 seconds. That's just the waiting period, the delay. Then they're asked, like a little circle shows up on the screen, and they're asked whether one of the dots from before was in this circled region on the screen or not. So that's a memory test, because once the dots have disappeared, that visual spatial information has to be held in your head during the intervening seconds. But now compare that to the bottom set of pictures here, which we might call a purely perceptual task. Like we have them look at a fixation cross, then show the dots for half a second, but then keep showing the dots when we ask whether or not one of the dots is in the circled region on the screen. So it's super easy, of course, right? This bottom perceptual version, super easy because it's just perceiving whether the dot is in there or not. Like you can look and see. But notice the tasks here are super similar in every other way, just that one of them requires remembering and the other doesn't. In other words, one has visuospatial working memory and the other doesn't require that. It's just the perceptual component. So on our fMRI data, when we're looking at blood flow to various regions of the brain in these two conditions, and we're comparing those, we could use a subtraction method. We can subtract the places of common activity to find areas that are distinct to visual spatial working memory, kind of above and beyond the purely perceptual elements, places where we get more activity than we do in just the perceptual task. And when we do that, we find certain occipital lobe areas and posterior, meaning back parietal lobe areas that are associated with visual working memory, the visual working memory like version of this task. In other words, dorsal stream areas, right? In addition to the prefrontal cortex, which that part shouldn't be surprising. All working memory makes the prefrontal cortex go off. And also this activity that's distinct to spatial working memory happens to be heavier in the right hemisphere of the brain, which is true in general of the brain that spatial tasks tend to recruit right hemisphere regions more heavily. So the right half of the brain is a little more specialized in spatial tasks. Now, in contrast, you might not be surprised to learn that working memory tasks that are more specific to the phonological loop, those recruit different areas. Instead of the occipital and posterior parietal ones we saw above, tend to have more temporal lobe activity, and also much heavier activity in the left hemisphere, specific to this, phonological loop, so verbal and auditory part of working memory, which makes sense because we know the left hemisphere is more heavily recruited during language tasks in general and auditory processing in general. Now, we won't get into these in detail, but just to give you an idea of some of the common working memory tasks you might see a cognitive psychologist use during a study of memory, oops, sorry about the screening there, would be tasks like this. So in the top, panel A in the upper left, we have what's called a retention delay task. It's a simple item memory task having them look at a fixation cross, then we show an item, then the item disappears, and then there's a delay during which I have to retain the information. So it's a retention delay task. So there's this delay, which we may or may not fill with some distracting activity, like counting backwards by 3 or something. But finally, at the end, we show them something and ask if it matches what they've seen before. So this is purely recognition task. Where in panel B in the upper right, we have a temporally ordered memory load task. Whew, long one. Where we might show them a bunch of items in a sequence, and then at the end, we show them some item and just ask, was it in the sequence that you saw? Or in panel panel C in the bottom here, the third one, we've got a temporal order task where they have to remember the order of things. Like, we'll show a sequence of items, which could be numbers or letters or words or pictures or whatever, but eventually at the test question at the end, they're asked, which of the two items was the most recent. So the whole time during the sequence, which might be a long sequence, you've got to remember the ordering of things to get it right. Or in the bottom right in panel D, we have what's called an in-back task. Most people find it challenging, though it's kind of fun to try out, and you can find versions of this online. Basically, you're seeing a sequence of items, so you're just seeing these numbers presented on the screen all in a row, nothing else going on, you're just seeing those numbers, and your goal, what you have to do is press a button. You have to note when an item shows up that was however many steps back. You're like, what does that mean? Well, for example, if we're doing a one-back task, so in could be any number here, but if the simplest version would be a one-back task, just means if you see a 6 and then you see a 6 right after it, you would press the button because what you're seeing right now matches the item that's one back. But if we have someone do a two-back task, then when like a 9 comes up on the screen, they have to decide if the item 2 previous from that was a 9. If so, they hit the button. Meanwhile, the sequence keeps going, right? And the next number comes up, maybe it's a 7, and now they have to decide if there was a 7 2 numbers before that one. So every time a number comes on the screen, you're thinking about what happened a couple numbers ago. But that's just the 2-back task. For a 3-back or a 4-back or a 5-back version, you have to hold even more in memory, and it keeps going. So I put the answers on here, so I was going to do this as a demonstration, but I guess we'll just talk through this. So I might, for a 3-back task, I might do an auditory version where I just read the letters to the participant out loud. So the participant would just be hearing these letters, not seeing them on the screen. Of course, we could do it on the screen instead. But if I'm just reading these letters aloud, for every letter I read, the participant would have to press a button if the letter they're hearing right then was the same letter they heard 3 back. So just for example, if I said something like A, B, C, A, you would tap on the second A because 3 letters back from that was another A. But if I said something more like B, D, B, D, B, D, you would never tap because the B's and the D's are only 2 back from each other, never 3 back. Got it? So if I did a sequence like this one, I would be saying T, L, H, C, H, O, C, Q, L, C, K, L, and so on. And as I'm doing that, the participant has to be listening, and when the T comes up, or I guess as you get a little further in, when the C comes up, they have to say, was that the same letter that I had 3 back? If not, they don't press the button. Then the H comes up. Okay, I did just hear an H, but was it 3 back? And maybe they're like, no, it was 2 back, so they don't press the button. The O comes up. Nope, doesn't match. The C comes up, and they might remember there was a C recently, but do they remember it was exactly 3 ago? That's the memory part of this. So this would be like a 3 back version of the task. We could, of course, do a 4 back or a 2 back or something like that. If we did a 4 back, then when this R came up at the end, they would have to press the button because there was an R 4 back. You get the idea. By the way, the in-back task, this is a very common working memory test. There's different versions we can do, but you'll see something like this in the literature a lot. And there are quite a few others, but I'll just mention 2 more. We might also do a working memory load task where we see how much of a load you can hold. This is called a span task. We've already seen this idea with a digit span task or a word span task. So you've got to repeat back the sequence of items in the correct order. This is a serial recall task, right? And we see how long we can make that sequence before you start screwing it up. And then the one in the right here on panel F, very similar idea, but we call it a running span task because you're doing some other processing in addition to holding those items in your memory. Like we might be flashing these simple math problems like 8 minus 3 and then 5 minus 2. And on each one, you've got to answer yes or no if the math is correct, if the answer there is correct for the math, while also remembering each of those answer digits. And then at the end, you repeat back those digits. And again, we adjust the length of this until we find your running span, the longest set that you can do fairly consistently. So that's the idea of working memory, which we've seen is just a more dynamic and complicated version of short-term memory that better describes how our brain seems to actually handle things in that intermediate space between sensory memory and long-term memory. In the next big set of videos, we're going to move on to the last piece of the modal model, which is long-term memory, the thing most people think about when you talk about memory colloquially in day-to-day conversation. So see you there.